The year was 1892, and in the small Wyoming town of Millbrook, reputation mattered more than rain in a drought. For those who didn't fit the rigid mold of what a proper woman should be, life could turn from difficult to impossible in the span of a single afternoon. This is the story of Josephine Campbell, who learned that sometimes the cruelest prisons are built not with bars, but with whispers, and that salvation can arrive in the most unexpected form, from the most unlikely source. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Josephine Campbell made her way toward the Millbrook Ladies' Academy, her walking stick clicking a steady rhythm against the wooden boardwalk. 26 years old, with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat and intelligent green eyes that missed little, she had learned long ago to hold her head high despite the pronounced limp that marked her left side. The childhood fever that had ravaged her leg at age 8 had left her with a permanent reminder, but it had never touched her spirit or her sharp mind. She taught literature and arithmetic to the daughters of Millbrook's more progressive families, those willing to overlook her physical limitation in favor of her exceptional education. Josephine's father, before his death 3 years prior, had been the town's physician, and he had insisted his only child receive the finest schooling available, even sending her to a female seminary in Boston for 2 years. That education had become her salvation after he passed, allowing her to support herself and her aging mother in the small house they had always called home. The academy occupied the second floor of the Grantham building, above the dry goods store. Josephine took the stairs slowly, using the banister for support, arriving at the classroom with enough time to arrange the day's lessons before her students appeared. She loved this quiet morning ritual, the way sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Here, in this room filled with books and the promise of young minds expanding, she felt most herself, most complete. Her students began arriving in groups of 2s and 3s, daughters of shopkeepers and ranchers, even one banker's daughter, whose mother had initially objected, but relented when no other teacher in town could match Josephine's credentials. The girls ranged from 10 to 16, and most had grown genuinely fond of their teacher, appreciating her patience and the way she made even the driest subjects come alive with stories and connections to the wider world. "Miss Campbell," called out 14-year-old Margaret Sutton as she entered, "Mother says we might get that new library everyone's been talking about. Is it true?" Josephine smiled, setting down the grammar text she'd been reviewing. "It's true, Margaret. The town council approved the funds last month. Your father was instrumental in making that happen, I believe." The morning passed in the comfortable flow of lessons and discussions. Josephine was midway through, explaining a particularly complex mathematical concept when the classroom door opened unexpectedly. Mrs. Henrietta Pierce, the stern-faced widow who served as the academy's administrator and primary benefactor, stood in the doorway with an expression that sent a chill through Josephine's chest. "Miss Campbell, a word in the hallway, if you please." Josephine excused herself, instructing the older girls to help the younger ones with their arithmetic problems. In the narrow hallway, Mrs. Pierce wasted no time with pleasantries. "I'm afraid I have difficult news," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when delivering blows they believe are justified. "The board met last evening. There have been concerns raised about your continued employment." Josephine felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "Concerns? My students' progress has been exemplary. Their test scores. This isn't about your teaching ability. Mrs. Pierce interrupted, though her expression suggested she found the entire conversation distasteful. It's about propriety. Several mothers have expressed discomfort with their daughters being taught by someone who, she paused, clearly searching for diplomatic phrasing, someone whose physical condition might give the girls improper ideas about what roles are suitable for women of limited capabilities. The words landed like physical blows. Josephine had faced prejudice before, subtle slights and lowered expectations, but never such blatant discrimination wrapped in the language of concern. Mrs. Pierce, my condition has never prevented me from fulfilling my duties. The decision has been made, Mrs. Pierce said firmly. We've hired Miss Catherine Walsh from Denver. She comes highly recommended and will begin next Monday. You'll be paid through the end of this week, naturally. Naturally. As if any of this was natural, as if destroying someone's livelihood and purpose with a week's notice was a reasonable act. This is because of Garrett Morrison, isn't it? Josephine heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. Because I refused his proposal. A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossed Mrs. Pierce's face before her expression hardened again. Mr. Morrison is a respected member of this community and a generous supporter of the Academy. His concerns, like those of the other board members, are valid. Garrett Morrison, Millbrook's wealthiest merchant, a widower of 43, who had decided 6 months ago that Josephine would make a suitable second wife. His proposal had been more business transaction than a romantic gesture, offered with the understanding that she should be grateful someone of his standing would overlook her imperfection. When she had politely declined, explaining that she valued her independence and her work, he had smiled tightly and warned her that independence was a luxury few could afford. Now she understood the true cost of that refusal. I see, Josephine said quietly. Thank you for the notice, Mrs. Pierce. She returned to her classroom, somehow managing to finish the day's lessons despite the roaring in her ears and the trembling in her hands. When the last student departed, Josephine sat at her desk, staring at the arithmetic problems still written on the slate board, trying to process the catastrophe that had just befallen her. Without her teaching salary, she and her mother would lose their home within months. Her mother's pension from her father's medical practice was minimal, barely enough for food and basic necessities. Josephine's small savings might stretch for a few weeks, perhaps a month, if they were extraordinarily frugal. But then what? The walk home that afternoon felt longer than usual, each step of her uneven gait a reminder of what others saw as her fundamental flaw. She noticed, perhaps for the first time in years, the way people's eyes slid away from her on the street, the way mothers pulled their children aside to let her pass, the whispers that followed in her wake. Her mother, Sarah Campbell, looked up from her mending when Josephine entered their small parlor. One glance at her daughter's face was enough. What's happened? Josephine told her everything, watching her mother's face age in the span of minutes. Sarah had been a beauty in her youth, the daughter of a successful grain merchant, but decades of being a doctor's wife in a frontier town had worn away the softness, leaving behind a woman of steel and practicality. Morrison, Sarah said when Josephine finished, the name carrying the weight of understanding. I warned you he wouldn't take rejection well. Men like that never do. So I should have married him? Josephine couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Spent my life as payment for the privilege of keeping my job? Of course not, her mother replied sharply. Your father didn't raise you to be any man's purchased goods. But we need to face facts. Without your salary. She trailed off, both of them knowing the conclusion too well to voice it. That evening, Josephine drafted letters to schools in neighboring towns, inquiring about teaching positions. She knew the odds were slim. Most schools preferred younger teachers, and news of her dismissal would travel. Morrison's influence extended beyond Millbrook. The next morning, determined to maintain her dignity, Josephine walked to the general store to purchase supplies. She needed to show Millbrook that she was unbowed, that their judgment hadn't broken her. It was a decision she would come to regret. The store was more crowded than usual, filled with ranchers and townspeople doing their weekly shopping. Josephine felt the shift in atmosphere the moment she entered, conversations dropping to whispers, eyes tracking her movements with newfound boldness. News of her dismissal had spread overnight, and with it, the implied permission to show their true feelings. She was examining a bolt of fabric when she heard the first comment, loud enough to be clearly intentional. "Shame about the academy, Mrs." Dorothy Webb said to her companion, though her voice carried across the store. "But really, what kind of example does it set for young girls? Teaching them they don't need to concern themselves with finding husbands, that they can just hobble along on their own?" Laughter rippled through the nearby shoppers. Josephine's face burned, but she kept her eyes on the fabric, refusing to react. "I heard Morrison offered for her." Another voice joined in. "Can you imagine? A man of his standing, and she turned him down. Must think pretty highly of herself. Pride goes before a fall," Mrs. Webb replied sagely. "Literally, in some cases." More laughter. Josephine abandoned the fabric and moved toward the counter where Mr. Fletcher, the store owner, was serving customers with studied neutrality. She had known Fletcher for years, had bought her school books from him, had always been treated with courtesy. Now, he barely met her eyes as she requested her items. As she waited, the crowd seemed to press closer. Someone jostled her deliberately, causing her to stumble. Her walking stick clattered to the floor, and when she bent to retrieve it, another foot kicked it just out of reach. "Oops," a male voice said, dripping with false concern. "So clumsy today." Josephine straightened, her face burning with humiliation. The stick lay several feet away, and the crowd had formed a loose circle around her, their faces wearing expressions ranging from cruel amusement to uncomfortable pity. She could walk to it, but her limp would be more pronounced without support, would give them exactly the spectacle they clearly craved. "Here now," Mr. Fletcher said weakly from behind the counter. Let's not do what?" Garrett Morrison's voice cut through the murmurs. He had entered from the store's back office, his expensive suit immaculate, his graying hair perfectly groomed. "Let's not acknowledge reality. Miss Campbell, I believe this is yours." He picked up the walking stick but didn't offer it to her. Instead, he held it, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Quite a crutch you've got here, metaphorically speaking, of course, but I suppose we all have our crutches, don't we? Some are just more visible than others." The crowd pressed closer, energized by Morrison's participation in their cruelty. Josephine felt panic rising in her chest, a trapped sensation she'd never experienced before in this town that had been her home for her entire life. "Mr. Morrison," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "my walking stick, please." "Certainly," he said, but instead of handing it to her, he leaned it against the far wall. "Right over there. Unless you'd like to reconsider our previous conversation, I'm a forgiving man, Miss Campbell. Despite everything, the offer still stands. You'd never want for anything. Your mother would be comfortable. All you'd have to do is accept your proper place." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Accept your proper place. Beneath him. Grateful. Owned. "No," Josephine said clearly. "Thank you, but no." Morrison's expression hardened. "Pride and foolishness. Very well. Enjoy your independence, Miss Campbell. I'm sure it will keep you warm when winter comes and you've no roof over your head." He strode past her, deliberately bumping her shoulder as he went. Off balance without her stick, Josephine stumbled, her weak leg unable to support her. She fell, her hands catching her against the rough wooden floor, her skirts tangling around her legs. The impact sent sharp pain shooting through her hip and ribs. The laughter that erupted was unbearable, not just from the cruel ones, but from people she had known for years, people whose children she had taught, whose ailments her father had treated. The sound of it was worse than the physical pain, worse than the humiliation of lying sprawled on the floor like a broken doll. No one helped her up. They simply stood there, watching, some laughing, others looking away in discomfort but doing nothing. Mrs. Webb made a tisking sound and said something about the wages of pride. Josephine pulled herself to her knees, then to her feet, using a nearby counter for support. Her hip screamed in protest, and she could feel wetness on her palms where the rough wood had scraped skin. She retrieved her walking stick from where Morrison had placed it, each step without support an agony that she refused to let show on her face. She walked out of that store with her head high, even as tears blurred her vision. She didn't run, didn't give them that satisfaction, just maintained her careful, limping pace all the way down Main Street, past the bank, past the hotel, past the church where she and her mother attended every Sunday. By the time she reached home, her carefully maintained composure shattered. She collapsed in the parlor, her mother rushing to her side, examining her bleeding palms and the bruise already forming on her hip. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They laughed, Josephine whispered, the shock of it still fresh. They all just laughed and watched me fall. Sarah's face was white with rage and helplessness. She had no solutions, no comforting words that wouldn't be empty lies. They both knew the truth. Millbrook had turned on Josephine completely. Morrison's influence had poisoned the well. That night, Josephine lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the windows of their small house. Everything she had built, every careful step she had taken to create a life of independence and purpose, had crumbled in less than 2 days. The teaching position was gone. Her reputation was destroyed. Her savings would last weeks, not months, and her mother, growing frailer each year, depended on her completely. She thought of her father, of his insistence that she could be anything despite her leg, that her mind was her greatest asset. He had been wrong. In a world where men like Morrison held power, where conformity mattered more than capability, her intelligence meant nothing. Her education was worthless. Her independence was a joke that others found hilarious. The only option seemed to be leaving Millbrook entirely. But where would they go? What town would hire a teacher with a limp and no references? How would they even afford the journey? As dawn broke over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Josephine Campbell made a decision. She would go to the larger towns, to Cheyenne, or even Denver if necessary. She would walk door to door if she had to, would accept any work that would keep her and her mother fed and housed. She had survived childhood illness, had overcome prejudice to build a career, and she would survive this too. But first, she needed supplies. And that meant one more trip into town, one more walk past the whispers and the stares. She dressed carefully in her sturdiest clothes, wrapped her scraped palms in clean bandages, and picked up her walking stick. Sarah watched her daughter prepare to face Millbrook again, pride and heartbreak warring in her expression. "You don't have to do this today," she said quietly. "We can wait." "No." Josephine replied, adjusting her hat with determined fingers. If I hide, they win. I'm not hiding. She stepped out into the cool morning air, began her uneven walk toward town, toward whatever fresh humiliations awaited. But this time, she told herself, she was prepared. This time, she wouldn't fall. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that a lonely rancher working his isolated property 15 miles north had decided that morning to come to town for supplies, or that their paths would cross in a way that would alter both their futures forever. Daniel Thorne had risen before dawn, as was his habit, to complete the morning chores on his ranch before making the long journey into Millbrook. At 34 years old, he had spent the last 6 years working his property alone, carving a modest but sustainable living from the harsh Wyoming landscape 15 miles north of town. His ranch wasn't large by territory standards, just 300 acres of grazing land with a small herd of cattle and a handful of horses, but it was his, paid for with years of hard labor and careful management. The ride into town took nearly 3 hours, time Daniel usually spent in comfortable solitude. He had never been a man of many words, even before the isolation of ranch life had reduced his conversations to occasional exchanges with his livestock. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that touched his collar, he moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to completing every task alone. His hands bore the calluses and scars of ranch work, his face the premature lines of a man who spent his days squinting against the prairie sun. He made the trip to Millbrook only once or twice a month, stocking up on supplies that would last until the next visit. The town held little appeal for him beyond its practical necessities. After his parents died, within months of each other during the harsh winter of 1886, Daniel had discovered that he preferred the company of silence to the empty condolences of acquaintances who had never truly known him or his family. His father had been a stern man, quick with criticism and slow with praise, who had built the ranch through sheer stubbornness and expected his only son to do the same. His mother had been gentler, but worn down by years of frontier hardship, fading gradually until she simply slipped away one February night. After their deaths, Daniel had found a strange peace in his isolation, a freedom from expectations and judgment that town life had never offered. As he guided his horse down Main Street that morning, the sun already climbing toward its midday position, Daniel noticed immediately that something unusual was happening near the general store. A crowd had gathered, larger than normal for a Wednesday morning, and their attention seemed focused on someone or something Daniel couldn't quite see from his angle. He dismounted, tying his horse to the rail outside the store, intending to simply push through the crowd and complete his business. But as he drew closer, the nature of the gathering became clear. This wasn't a normal cluster of shoppers. There was an ugliness to it, a mob mentality that set his teeth on edge. "Look at her trying to walk like normal folk," a woman's voice carried clearly. "Thinks she's too good for honest charity. Should have taken Morrison's offer when she had the chance," a man added. "Now she's just another beggar with heirs." Daniel worked his way to the edge of the crowd and finally saw what they were watching. A woman in a dark blue dress, probably close to his own age, was attempting to navigate the rutted street with the aid of a walking stick. Her left leg dragged noticeably, and the uneven ground made each step a visible challenge. But it was her face that caught Daniel's attention, the fierce determination in her expression, the way she held her head high despite the obvious pain each movement caused. She was trying to reach the boardwalk, but the crowd had spread out in a way that forced her to take the longest, most difficult route. Deliberately, Daniel realized with growing anger, they were making sport of her struggle. 5 cents says she falls before she reaches Fletcher's. "Door!" a young man called out, and several others laughed, reaching for their coins. The woman, Josephine he would learn later, kept moving forward. Her jaw was set, her knuckles white on the handle of her walking stick. She was perhaps 10 feet from the boardwalk when her stick caught in a particularly deep rut. She stumbled, catching herself before she fell completely, but the motion wrenched a small gasp of pain from her lips. The crowd erupted in laughter and jeering comments. Daniel watched several people he recognized, shopkeepers and ranchers he'd done business with for years, participate in the cruelty with evident enjoyment. Mrs. Webb, who ran the boarding house, was actually clapping her hands in delight at the spectacle. Something cold and hard settled in Daniel's chest. He had witnessed meanness before, the casual cruelty of frontier life, where weakness was often punished rather than pitied. But this was different. This was organized, deliberate, a town systematically destroying one of its own for entertainment. The woman had regained her balance and continued forward. She was close to the boardwalk now, close to escape, when a boy of perhaps 12, encouraged by the adults around him, darted forward and kicked her walking stick out from under her mid-step. This time she did fall, hard, landing on her hands and knees in the dirt. Her hat tumbled off, revealing auburn hair that had been neatly pinned but was now coming loose. The crowd's laughter reached a crescendo, and Daniel saw several people actually pointing, doubled over with mirth at her predicament. The woman didn't cry out. She simply knelt there for a moment, her shoulders straight despite everything, before beginning the difficult process of rising without support. Her stick had rolled several feet away, and no one moved to retrieve it. They just watched, waiting to see if she would crawl for it, eager for more entertainment. Daniel moved before conscious thought caught up with action. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the protests and surprised exclamations, and reached the woman in a few long strides. He bent down, not for her stick, but for her, scooping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. The laughter died instantly, replaced by shocked silence. "What do you think you're doing?" Garrett Morrison's voice cut through the quiet. He had emerged from the general store, clearly having orchestrated the morning's entertainment from a prime viewing position. "Put her down. She's fine." Daniel ignored him, adjusting the woman in his arms. She had gone rigid with shock, her green eyes wide as she stared up at him. Up close, he could see the scraped palms, the dirt on her dress, the exhaustion beneath the determination. "You're Daniel Thorne," Morrison continued, stepping forward. "From the North property. This doesn't concern you. This is a town matter." "I'm making it my concern," Daniel said quietly. His voice was rusty from disuse, but it carried, clearly in the silence. "And what I'm seeing is a pack of cowards tormenting someone who can't fight back." A murmur ran through the crowd, part shock, part indignation. Morrison's face flushed red. "You don't understand the situation. This woman—" "I don't need to understand anything except what I just saw," Daniel interrupted. He looked down at the woman in his arms. "Where are you trying to go?" She stared at him for a long moment, clearly torn between pride and necessity. He could feel her trembling, though whether from pain, humiliation, or anger, he couldn't tell. "Home," she finally whispered. "The White House with blue shutters, 3 blocks north." Daniel nodded once and began walking, still carrying her, the crowd parting before him like water around a stone. Behind them, Morrison was sputtering protests, but Daniel didn't look back. He just kept walking, his boots making solid sounds against the boardwalk, then quieter thuds in the dirt street beyond. "I can walk," the woman said after half a block, her voice stronger now. "You can put me down. I know you can." Daniel replied, not breaking stride. But you don't have to. They continued in silence past the hotel, past the church, where curious faces appeared in windows. Daniel was acutely aware of the weight in his arms, not the physical burden which was negligible, but the responsibility he had just assumed by intervening. This town had turned on her for reasons he didn't understand, and by helping her so publicly, he had aligned himself against them. It should have concerned him. He relied on Millbrook for supplies, for the occasional need to hire seasonal help, for the market where he sold his cattle. Antagonizing the town's power structure was a poor strategy for a man who lived alone and needed to maintain civil relations. But something about the scene he had witnessed, about the casual cruelty and the woman's stubborn dignity in the face of it, had awakened something in him that he thought had died with his parents. A sense of justice, perhaps, or simply a recognition of something familiar. He knew what it meant to be alone, to face the world without support. He had chosen that isolation. She clearly had not. The White House with blue shutters appeared ahead, small but well-maintained, with a neat garden front and lace curtains in the windows. As they approached, the door flew open and an older woman rushed out, her face pale with alarm. "Josephine, what happened? Who are you?" "I'm fine, Mother," the woman in Daniel's arms said quickly. "There was an incident in town. This man helped me." Daniel climbed the porch steps and gently set Josephine down in the wooden chair that sat beside the door. She immediately tried to stand, to prove her capability, but her mother's firm hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Thank you," the older woman said, turning to Daniel with an expression that combined gratitude and wariness. "I'm Sarah Campbell. This is my daughter, Josephine. We're in your debt." "No debt," Daniel said automatically. He picked up his hat, which he'd lost somewhere during the carrying, only to realize he'd left it tied to his saddle back at the store. He felt suddenly awkward, standing on this porch with two women staring at him, uncertain what came next. "You're Daniel Thorne," Sarah said, studying him with sharp eyes. "From the northern property. Your father was Robert Thorne." "Yes, ma'am. I knew your mother slightly. She was a kind woman." Sarah's expression softened marginally. "What did my daughter do to warrant being carried through town?" "She didn't do anything except refuse to give people the satisfaction of seeing her defeated," Daniel replied. He looked at Josephine, who was examining her scraped palms with fierce concentration, avoiding his gaze. "Miss Campbell, do you need a doctor?" "We can't afford a doctor," Josephine said bluntly, finally meeting his eyes. "And I've had worse. Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Thorne. I apologize for the inconvenience." The formality in her tone was a clear dismissal, a retreat behind the walls of propriety and pride. Daniel recognized it because he used the same defense himself. But he also saw what she was trying to hide, the way her hands shook as she examined them, the pallor beneath her sun-touched skin, the exhaustion that went deeper than physical weariness. "What will you do?" he heard himself ask. "They'll be waiting for you next time you go to town." Josephine's laugh was bitter. "Then I suppose I won't go to town. Problem solved." "Josephine," her mother said sharply, warning in her tone. "What would you have me say, Mother?" Josephine's composure was cracking, emotion breaking through. "That everything fine? That good people prevail?" Father believed that, and look where it got him. Worked himself to death for people who now find it entertaining to watch his daughter fall in the street. Sarah's face tightened with pain, but she said nothing. The truth was too raw to argue with. Daniel stood there, feeling like an intruder on this private moment of despair. He should leave, should walk back to his horse and ride away to his isolated ranch where other people's problems couldn't touch him. That was what he had done for 6 years, and it had served him well. "I need someone to help with my property," he said instead, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "General work, cooking, some livestock management, property maintenance, room and board included, plus wages." Both women stared at him as if he'd started speaking a foreign language. "I don't understand," Sarah said slowly. "You're offering employment?" "Yes, ma'am. To both of you, if you're willing. The ranch house is bigger than I need. Built for a family, not one person. 3 bedrooms sitting empty. Kitchen that hasn't seen proper cooking in years. I'm not much for housekeeping myself." "Mr. Thorne," Josephine said, her voice tight, "I appreciate your kindness, but I'm hardly suited for ranch work. As you may have noticed." "I noticed you kept getting up every time they knocked you down," Daniel replied evenly. "That's the main qualification for ranch life. Everything else can be learned." "This is charity," Josephine said flatly. "Pity dressed up as employment." "It's not." Daniel met her challenging gaze directly. "I've been managing alone for 6 years. It's inefficient. I spend half my time on cooking and cleaning that could be better spent on livestock and land management. Your mother looks like she knows her way around a kitchen. You're educated, which means you can keep accounts, handle correspondence with buyers, maybe even teach me proper grammar so I don't sound like a fool at cattle auctions." He saw the flicker of interest in Josephine's eyes before pride pushed it back down. "And my leg? That doesn't concern you?" "Only if it keeps you from doing the work," Daniel said with a shrug. "Which I don't think it will. Most of what I'm talking about doesn't require running races. It requires good sense and dependability. From what I saw today, you've got both in abundance." Sarah was watching him with an expression of cautious hope, but she remained silent, letting her daughter make the decision. Josephine looked away, staring at the neat garden her mother tended, at the small house that wouldn't be theirs much longer, at the town visible in the distance where her entire life had collapsed in the span of days. Daniel watched the calculation happen behind her eyes, the weighing of pride against survival, independence against necessity. "How much?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel named a wage that was more than fair, perhaps slightly more than the work strictly merited, but not so much that it would feel like charity. He saw her eyes widen slightly, saw her mother's sharp intake of breath. "That's generous," Sarah said carefully. "Perhaps too generous. It's what the work is worth to me," Daniel replied. "I'm not a charitable man, Mrs. Campbell. If I'm offering this, it's because I need the help, and I think your daughter is capable of providing it. If she proves otherwise, we part ways. If it works out, everyone benefits. That's business, not pity." The logic of it seemed to reach Josephine in a way that kindness alone might not have. She looked at her mother, some silent communication passing between them, years of shared experience compressed into a single glance. "We'll need time to settle our affairs here," Josephine said finally, turning back to Daniel. "A week, perhaps." "A week is fine. I'll come back next Wednesday with a wagon for your belongings." Daniel felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension at her acceptance. He had just fundamentally altered his life with an impulsive offer, taking on responsibility for 2 people he barely knew. The isolation he had cultivated so carefully was about to end. "Mr. Thorne," Josephine said as he turned to leave. When he looked back, she was sitting straighter, some of the defeat gone from her posture. "Why did you help me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Daniel considered the question, searching for an answer that was both honest and complete. "Because it was wrong," he said finally, "what they were doing to you. And because He paused, choosing his words carefully, because I know what it's like to feel alone. Nobody should have to feel that way if there's another option. He left before she could respond, walking back toward town with long strides. His horse was still tied outside the general store, and a small knot of people stood nearby, clearly waiting to confront him. Morrison was at the center of them, his face still flushed with anger. "That was foolish, Thorne," Morrison said, as Daniel untied his horse. "You've made an enemy today." "I'll survive it," Daniel replied, swinging into the saddle. "Will you? You need this town. Supplies, buyers for your cattle, laborers when Roundup comes. You think people will be eager to do business with someone who sides with that? With her?" Daniel looked down at Morrison from horseback, and something in his expression made the merchant take a half-step backward. "I think anyone who won't do business with me over this wasn't worth doing business with in the first place," Daniel said quietly. "And if you or your friends go near those women again, if I hear about any more incidents like what I saw today, you'll discover I'm not nearly as patient as I look." He didn't wait for a response, just turned his horse and began the long ride home. Behind him, he could hear the murmurs of the crowd, speculation and outrage mixing together. He had made enemies today, had complicated his life in ways that would have consequences he couldn't yet predict. But as he rode north toward his empty ranch house, Daniel found he didn't regret it. For the first time in 6 years, he felt something other than numb acceptance of his isolated existence. Purpose, perhaps, or maybe just the simple satisfaction of having done the right thing, regardless of cost. In 1 week, Josephine and Sarah Campbell would arrive at his property, bringing with them all the complications of human connection he had worked so hard to avoid. His quiet, controlled life was about to become significantly less predictable. Daniel discovered he was almost looking forward to it. True to his word, Daniel arrived at the Campbell house the following Wednesday with a sturdy farm wagon hitched to 2 draft horses. The morning was crisp, autumn beginning to assert itself across the Wyoming landscape with touches of gold in the cottonwood leaves and a sharper edge to the wind. He found both women ready, their belongings packed into 3 modest trunks and several carpet bags arranged neatly on the porch. Josephine wore a practical traveling dress in dark gray, her hair braided and pinned severely back. She looked tired, dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting sleepless nights, but her jaw was set with determination. Sarah appeared more uncertain, her hands twisting in her apron as she watched Daniel approach. "Good morning," Daniel said, removing his hat. "I'll load these up." He worked quickly and efficiently, securing the trunks in the wagon bed, while the women made a final inspection of the house they were leaving behind. Through the open door, he could hear their quiet voices, Sarah's breaking with emotion as she said goodbye to the home where she'd lived for over 30 years. When they emerged, Sarah's eyes were red but dry, her expression resolute. Josephine's face showed no emotion at all, a careful blankness that Daniel recognized as protective armor. He helped Sarah onto the wagon bench first, then turned to assist Josephine. She hesitated, clearly wrestling with accepting help, even for something as simple as climbing aboard. Finally, with visible reluctance, she allowed him to steady her as she maneuvered awkwardly onto the seat. Her jaw clenched when her weak leg protested the movement, but she made no sound of complaint. The ride north took the better part of the morning. Daniel kept the horses to a steady but unhurried pace, mindful that the rutted road would be uncomfortable for his passengers. For the first hour, no one spoke beyond basic pleasantries. The silence wasn't entirely uncomfortable, but it carried the weight of uncertainty, 3 near strangers bound together by necessity rather than choice. It was Sarah who finally broke the quiet, pointing to a distant herd of pronghorn antelope grazing on the open prairie. Beautiful creatures. My husband always said they were the soul of the plains. Fast, too, Daniel added. Fastest animal in North America. I've seen them outrun my best horse without breaking stride. The conversation opened slowly after that, tentative exchanges about the landscape, the weather, the approaching winter. Daniel found himself talking more than he had in years, describing his property and the work that needed doing. Sarah asked practical questions about the kitchen setup and food storage. Josephine remained mostly silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if trying to see what awaited them. The ranch came into view just before noon, nestled in a shallow valley with a creek running along its eastern boundary. The house was larger than Daniel had led them to believe, a solid two-story structure built from local timber and stone. It showed signs of neglect, the porch needing repair and paint peeling from the window frames, but the bones were good. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, all in various states of disrepair. "It's more isolated than I expected," Josephine said quietly, her first words in miles. "Nearest neighbor is 8 miles east," Daniel confirmed. "Town is 15 south. In winter, we might go weeks without seeing another soul." He watched her face for signs of second thoughts. But she simply nodded, absorbing this information without visible reaction. Sarah, however, looked troubled. "That's quite isolated for women alone, if you're out working the property," she said carefully. "I won't be far," Daniel replied, "and I'll teach you both to handle a rifle. Out here, that's not optional." He pulled the wagon up to the house and began unloading their belongings. The interior was dusty but spacious, with a large kitchen dominated by a cast-iron stove, a parlor with furniture covered in sheets, and upstairs, 3 bedrooms that hadn't been occupied in years. Sarah immediately set about opening windows and assessing what cleaning supplies would be needed. Josephine stood in the parlor, leaning on her walking stick, taking in her new reality with that same carefully blank expression. "The bedroom at the end of the hall gets the best morning light," Daniel offered. "Thought that might suit you. Your mother can take the one next to it. I'm across the hall if you need anything." "Very proper," Josephine said, and he couldn't tell if she was being sarcastic or simply stating fact. The first week passed in a flurry of cleaning and organizing. Sarah threw herself into the work with an energy that belied her years, scrubbing surfaces that hadn't seen proper attention in half a decade, organizing the kitchen according to efficient principles developed over decades of housekeeping. She discovered that Daniel's idea of stocking the pantry meant bags of flour and coffee beans, with little consideration for variety or proper meal planning. "When do you slaughter?" she asked on the second day, hands on her hips as she surveyed his inadequate supplies. "Usually late October. Couple of steers for winter meat," Daniel replied. "And chickens? I see the coop but no birds. Hawks got the last of them 2 years ago. Haven't replaced them." Sarah made a sound of profound disapproval. "A ranch without chickens. We'll need to remedy that. And a proper garden come spring. You can't live on beef and coffee alone." Daniel found himself agreeing to trips to town for supplies, to purchasing laying hens from a neighboring ranch, to Sarah's increasingly ambitious plans for restoring proper domestic order to his bachelor existence. It was easier than arguing, and truthfully, he appreciated the transformation she was working. The house was beginning to feel lived in again, almost like it had when his mother was alive. Josephine's integration into ranch life was more complicated. Her physical limitations made many tasks impossible, and she approached each challenge with a mixture of determination and barely suppressed frustration. On the third day, Daniel found her struggling to carry water from the pump to the house, the bucket's weight combined with her uneven gait, resulting in more water spilled than delivered. "There's a better way," he said, approaching carefully. She had developed a sharp defensiveness about offers of help, interpreting them as implications of inadequacy. "I can manage," she replied through gritted teeth, refilling the bucket. "I know you can. But managing and doing it efficiently are different things." He disappeared into the barn and returned with a wooden yoke designed to distribute weight across the shoulders. "Try this. My mother used it. Takes the strain off your legs, puts it where you're stronger." Josephine examined the device skeptically, but after another failed attempt with the bucket alone, she allowed Daniel to show her how to position the yoke. The improvement was immediate. She could carry water with relative ease, her upper body strength compensating for what her leg couldn't provide. "Better?" Daniel asked. "Yes," she admitted grudgingly. Then, after a pause, "Thank you." It became a pattern. Daniel would observe Josephine struggling with some task, would quietly devise a modification or alternative approach, and would present it without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. A higher stool for kitchen work that allowed her to sit while helping her mother. A reorganization of the chicken coop so feed and water were accessible without navigating uneven ground. A mounting block that made saddling a horse possible without assistance. "You've given this considerable thought," Josephine observed one afternoon as Daniel installed a handrail along the porch steps. "Just common sense," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Every person's built different, got different strengths. Senseless not to work with what you've got. Most people don't see it that way. They see limitation and stop there." Daniel paused, meeting her gaze directly. "Then most people are fools. You're one of the most capable people I've met, Miss Campbell. Your leg doesn't change that." Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the defensive walls. "Josephine," she said quietly, "if we're going to be working together, you might as well call me Josephine. Daniel, then. No need for formality out here." As weeks passed, Josephine began taking on the ranch's bookkeeping and correspondence. Daniel's records had been haphazard at best, scribbled notes in margins and figures that didn't always add up correctly. She organized everything into proper ledgers, identified areas where he was losing money through poor planning, and drafted professional letters to cattle buyers that resulted in better prices than he'd ever received. "You're good at this," he said, reviewing her work one evening. They had fallen into a routine of going over accounts after supper while Sarah mended clothes nearby. "I ran the household finances after my father died," Josephine replied. "He left us comfortable, but it required careful management. Then I taught mathematics. Numbers make sense. They're logical, predictable. Unlike people." "Most people are predictable too," Daniel observed. "Just not in ways we'd like." Josephine looked up from the ledger, really studying him for perhaps the first time. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone simpler, I suppose. A rough frontiersman, without much education or refinement. But you read, you think carefully before speaking, you notice details most people miss." She hesitated. "Why do you live out here alone? A man with your property, your prospects, you could have a proper life in town." Daniel set down the account book, uncomfortable with the personal turn. "Had a proper life in town once. When my parents were alive, we'd go in for church, socials, all the expected things. After they died, I realized I'd been going through motions, playing a part because it was expected. Out here, I don't have to pretend to be anything except what I am." "And what are you?" Someone who prefers solitude to bad company and honest work to empty conversation. He met her gaze. Same question back to you. Why didn't you leave Millbrook after your father died? You had education, connections through the academy. You could have gone east, found a position somewhere your leg wouldn't matter so much. Josephine's expression tightened. My mother, she's lived in that house since she married. All her memories are there. I couldn't ask her to leave. But you've asked her to leave now. I didn't have a choice. The bitterness leaked through despite her control. Morrison made sure of that. Tell me about Morrison, Daniel said, sensing there was more to the story than he'd understood. Josephine was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral, drained of emotion. Garrett Morrison is the kind of man who believes the world exists for his benefit. He came to Millbrook 10 years ago with money from back east, bought out half the businesses on Main Street, and proceeded to run them with ruthless efficiency. His first wife died 5 years ago in childbirth, along with the baby. People said he barely mourned, just looked for her replacement like he'd replace a broken tool. She traced the edge of the ledger with one finger, not looking at Daniel. He proposed 6 months ago. Very businesslike. Said I was educated enough to be presentable, that my leg wouldn't matter since I'd mostly be keeping his house and wouldn't need to walk much in public. He actually said that it wouldn't matter because he didn't plan to parade me around. What did you say? I thanked him for the offer and declined. Explained that I valued my position at the academy, that I had no desire to marry. A bitter smile touched her lips. He told me I was being unrealistic, that women like me couldn't afford to refuse practical arrangements. When I insisted, he warned me that independence was expensive. I didn't understand what he meant until he had me dismissed. Daniel felt anger kindling again, the same cold fury he'd experienced watching the crowd torment her in the street. He's a bully. Bullies only understand one language. What language is that? Force. Someone standing up to them who isn't afraid of the consequences. Like you did, Josephine said softly. You made an enemy that day. Morrison doesn't forget slights. Neither do I. Daniel stood, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. I should check the horses before bed. Early start tomorrow? We're moving the herd to the north pasture. Can I help? The question surprised them both. You've never worked cattle, Daniel pointed out. No, but I can learn. You said yourself that most ranch work is about good sense and dependability. Let me prove I have both. Daniel considered her determined expression, the challenge in her eyes. All right, but it'll be a long day in the saddle. Your leg up to it? Only one way to find out. The next morning it dawned cold and grey, threatening rain. Daniel saddled 3 horses, including his gentlest mare for Josephine. She approached the animal with obvious apprehension, but refused assistance mounting. It took her 3 attempts, her face flushed with effort and embarrassment by the end. But she managed it. The work of moving 40 head of cattle 5 miles north was tedious and occasionally frustrating. The animals, sensing the coming weather, were skittish and uncooperative. Daniel rode point, guiding the herd's direction, while Josephine flanked from the side, learning through trial and error how to read the cattle's movements and anticipate their attempts to break away. She fell twice, her horse startled by a charging steer. Both times she pulled herself back into the saddle without complaint, though Daniel could see the pain each fall caused. By midday, she was moving with the herd more confidently, anticipating problems before they developed, even managing to turn back several escape attempts. They were 3 miles out when the rain started, light at first, then building to a steady downpour. The cattle grew more agitated, and one large steer broke away, heading toward a ravine that Daniel knew dropped off sharply just beyond the nearest ridge. He spurred after it, but his horse stumbled in the slick grass, going down hard. Daniel managed to kick free of the stirrups, but the fall knocked the wind from his lungs. Through blurred vision, he saw the steer still heading for the ravine. If it went over, it could break a leg or worse, and in this weather, recovery would be nearly impossible. Then Josephine was there, her mare pounding past him in pursuit of the steer. She rode hard, leaning forward in the saddle, her walking stick abandoned, nothing but determination driving her forward. She cut in front of the steer just before it reached the ravine edge, turning it back toward the herd with a combination of positioning and sheer nerve. By the time Daniel got to his feet and caught his spooked horse, Josephine had the steer moving back toward the main group. She was soaked through, hair plastered to her face, but there was triumph in her expression when she rode up beside him. "You all right?" she called over the end. "Rain." "Fine. That was good work." "I was terrified," she admitted, breathless. "That thing must weigh 10 times what I do, but you did it anyway. That's what counts." They finished moving the herd in the rain, both soaked and exhausted by the time they reached the north pasture and secured the gates. The ride back to the ranch house was made in companionable silence, the kind that comes from shared accomplishment. Sarah met them at the door with towels and hot coffee, scolding them both for catching their deaths in the storm. But she saw something had changed between them, an ease that hadn't been there before. That evening, as they sat by the fire drying out, Daniel looked at Josephine and saw not a woman limited by her leg, but a person who had proven herself capable when it mattered. She had faced her fear, had pushed past pain and doubt, and had done what needed doing. "You earned your wages today," he said simply. Josephine smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Does that mean I can do it again tomorrow? If you're willing, but maybe without the rain this time." Sarah watched them from her chair, a knowing look in her eyes. Her daughter was finding her way back to herself, discovering strengths that Millbrook had tried to destroy. And Daniel Thorne, the lonely rancher who claimed to prefer solitude, was learning that some company was worth the complications it brought. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the ranch house, warmth and purpose were taking root. The first snow came early that year, a light dusting in mid-October that melted by noon but served as warning of what was coming. Daniel stood on the porch that morning, coffee in hand, watching the white powder transform the landscape into something temporarily pristine. Behind him, he could hear Sarah moving around the kitchen, the clatter of pans and the warm smell of frying bacon filling the house with domestic comfort he'd forgotten existed. 6 weeks had passed since the Campbells arrived, and the ranch had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The house gleamed with Sarah's relentless cleaning. The kitchen garden showed the last stubborn vegetables before the killing frost, and the accounts were organized with a precision that revealed just how poorly Daniel had been managing his finances. But more than the physical changes, the property felt alive again, purposeful in a way it hadn't since his parents died. Josephine emerged from the barn, leading Daniel's gelding already saddled for the day's work. She moved with increasing confidence now, her limp still pronounced, but no longer the defining characteristic of her movement. She had learned to anticipate the horse's reactions, to position herself efficiently, to use momentum and leverage rather than fighting against her limitations. "Weather's turning," she called up to him. "How long before the pass becomes impassable?" "Another month. Maybe 6 weeks if we're lucky," Daniel replied. "Why?" "Because we're low on winter supplies, and if your records are accurate, last year you nearly ran out of feed for the livestock by February." We need to make arrangements now. She had a point. Daniel's tendency was to deal with problems as they arose, rather than planning ahead. It had cost him animals and money more than once. "I'll ride to Hendrick's place today," he said. "Tom usually has surplus hay he's willing to sell." "I'll come with you." Daniel hesitated. The Hendricks ranch was 8 miles east, and Tom Hendricks was one of the few neighboring ranchers Daniel still maintained cordial relations with. But Tom's wife, Martha, was a notorious gossip with strong opinions about proper behavior. Bringing Josephine would invite questions and judgments that Daniel had so far avoided by keeping his new arrangement private. "Might be better if I go alone," he suggested carefully. "Martha Hendricks has a sharp tongue." Josephine's expression hardened. "So I should hide? Pretend I don't exist? I thought the point of coming here was to stop hiding." She was right, and Daniel knew it. He'd been protecting both of them by maintaining isolation, but winter was coming, and he couldn't manage everything alone. Eventually he would need to do business with his neighbors, and they would need to accept that his circumstances had changed. "Fair enough," he conceded, "but prepare yourself. Martha's opinions are..." Freely expressed, they set out mid-morning, riding side by side across the rolling prairie. The autumn sun was pale but warm, and occasional flocks of geese passed overhead, heading south in perfect formation. Josephine had grown comfortable in the saddle, her body adapting to the rhythm of riding in ways that minimized the weakness in her leg. "Tell me about the Hendricks," she said as they rode. "Tom's solid. Hard worker, honest dealer. We've helped each other out over the years, shared labor during roundup, that sort of thing." "Martha's," Daniel searched for. Diplomatic phrasing, different. Believes there's a right way to do everything and isn't shy about sharing her views. Sounds delightful. She means well. Mostly. The Hendricks spread came into view an hour later, a prosperous-looking ranch with well-maintained buildings and extensive corrals. Several horses grazed in a nearby pasture, and Daniel could see Tom working near the barn. As they approached, Tom straightened, shading his eyes against the sun. His expression shifted from welcome to surprise when he registered Daniel's companion. "Thorne," Tom called out, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Wasn't expecting you. And you've brought..." He trailed off, clearly uncertain how to finish. "This is Josephine Campbell," Daniel said as they dismounted. "She's been helping manage my property." Josephine, Tom Hendricks. Tom was a barrel-chested man in his 50s, with a weathered face and shrewd eyes. He took Josephine's offered hand with obvious uncertainty, his gaze flickering to her walking stick and back to her face. "Ma'am," he said cautiously. "Daniel's property, you say?" "The business side of it," Josephine clarified. "Accounts, correspondence, supply management. My mother handles the domestic work." The front door of the ranch house banged open, and Martha Hendricks emerged, a sturdy woman with iron-gray hair and an expression of intense curiosity. She marched across the yard with the determination of someone who smelled scandal. "Daniel Thorne," she announced, "you haven't been to Sunday services in 2 months, and now you show up with a woman I don't recognize. Start explaining." "Martha, this is Miss Josephine Campbell," Daniel began, but Martha was already circling Josephine like a hawk, examining prey. "Campbell, any relation to Doc Campbell from Millbrook? His daughter?" Josephine replied, meeting Martha's scrutiny with calm directness. "I heard about you, about Morrison and the academy business." Martha's expression was impossible to read. "Heard different versions. Some say you got what you deserved for putting on airs. Others say Morrison's a snake who crushed you for saying no. Which is it?" "Martha," Tom said sharply, "that's none of our concern. It is if she's working at our neighbor's ranch, Martha shot back. She turned to Daniel. What's the arrangement here? You didn't mention hiring help. Didn't realize I needed your permission, Daniel replied mildly, though his jaw was tight. Don't get prickly. I'm just asking what half the territory will ask when word spreads. You've got an unmarried woman living at your place? Her mother too, I'd hope? Yes, Sarah Campbell is there as well, Daniel confirmed. The arrangement is entirely proper and, more importantly, entirely my business. Martha studied him for a long moment, then surprised everyone by laughing. Fair enough, Tom. Offer these people some hospitality instead of standing there like a fence post. Over coffee in the Hendricks kitchen, the conversation gradually relaxed into practicalities. Daniel negotiated for 3 wagon loads of hay at a reasonable price, delivery to be made before the first major snow. Martha, meanwhile, subjected Josephine to what amounted to a friendly interrogation, questions about her education, her skills, her intentions. Can you shoot? Martha asked suddenly. I'm learning, Josephine replied. Daniel's been teaching me. Good. Out here it's not optional, especially for women. Too much can go wrong too fast. Martha refilled her coffee cup. You planning to stay through winter? That's the plan. Winter's hard in these parts. Isolation gets to people. You sure you're up for it? Josephine met Martha's challenging gaze steadily. I've survived worse than isolation, Mrs. Hendricks. Something in her tone must have satisfied Martha because the older woman nodded approvingly. I expect you have... All right, here's how it is. I don't care what happened in Millbrook. That's town business and I've got no patience for town politics. But out here, we help our neighbors because we all need help sometimes. You're working at Thorne's Ranch. That makes you part of this community, whether you like it or not. I appreciate that, Josephine said carefully. Don't appreciate it yet. Appreciation comes with obligations. There's a work gathering at the Morrison Ranch in 2 weeks. Not Garrett Morrison, his cousin Samuel from up north. Barn raising. Every able-bodied person in the area helps, and in return they help you when you need it. You'll be expected to come. Daniel tensed. A gathering of neighboring ranchers meant exposure to judgment, gossip, and potentially hostile reactions. But Martha was right about the obligations of the frontier community. You couldn't take help without offering it in return. We'll be there, he said before Josephine could respond. The ride back to Daniel's ranch was quiet, both of them processing the implications of what Martha had said. Finally, Josephine broke the silence. You didn't have to accept me. I can handle my own decisions. I know, but she's right about how things work out here. If we refuse to participate, we'll be isolated when we need help. And we will need help. Even if people treat me the way they did in Millbrook. Daniel reined in his horse, waiting until Josephine stopped beside him. If anyone treats you that way, they'll answer me. But most ranchers aren't like town folk. They care more about whether you can pull your weight than about social niceties. My leg isn't going to matter as much as you think. There's plenty to do at a barn raising that doesn't require climbing ladders. Food preparation, organizing supplies, keeping track of tools and materials. Things you're good at. Josephine studied him, something shifting in her expression. You really believe that, don't you? That I belong here? You've earned your place, Daniel said simply. Now you just have to claim it. The 2 weeks before the gathering passed in a flurry of preparation. Sarah insisted on baking bread and preserves to contribute, a gesture of goodwill that Daniel suspected would matter more than any amount of physical labor. Josephine threw herself into practicing the skills she would need, improving her shooting with Daniel's patient instruction, learning to harness and drive the wagon, studying the basics of carpentry in case she could assist with simpler construction tasks. The morning of the barn raising dawned clear and cold. They loaded the wagon with Sarah's contributions and Daniel's tools, setting out before sunrise for the 3-hour journey to Samuel Morrison's property. As they drew closer, other wagons appeared on the converging trails, neighbors gathering from across the scattered ranching community. Samuel Morrison's place was bustling with activity when they arrived. The barn's foundation had already been laid, lumber stacked in organized piles, and teams of men were sorting materials while women set up long tables for the midday meal. Samuel himself, a lean man in his 40s with none of his cousin's predatory swagger, greeted each arrival personally. "Thorne," he called out, striding over. "Good to see you. Wasn't sure you'd come. Needed barn last year." "You helped," Daniel replied, shaking Samuel's hand. "Same courtesy back." Samuel's gaze moved to Josephine and Sarah. "Your new neighbors?" "Josephine and Sarah Campbell. They're managing my property." "Campbell," Samuel repeated, recognition flickering across his face. He knew about Millbrook, about Garrett, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Welcome. We can use all the help we can get." "Ma'am," he addressed Sarah, "food tables are over there if you want to add your contributions. Miss Campbell, you comfortable with organizational work? We need someone tracking tool distribution and making sure materials get where they're needed." It was a test, Josephine realized, but also a genuine offer of meaningful work. "I can do that." The day unfolded in organized chaos. Men formed teams for different construction tasks, the sound of hammering and sawing filling the air. Women moved between food preparation and support roles, bringing water and supplies to the workers. Josephine established herself at a central table, creating a system for tracking tools and materials that impressed Samuel enough that he consulted her frequently about logistics. Not everyone was welcoming. A few women whispered when Josephine passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. One older rancher, Chester Blackwood, made his opinions clear when he needed a particular saw. "This is what Thorne's ranch has come to?" he muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Taking in town charity cases?" Josephine felt heat rise in her face, but kept her voice level. "The saw you need is at the north corner, Mr. Blackwood. 3rd tool chest." "I'll find it myself. Don't need help from cripples." The words hung in the air, drawing uncomfortable glances from nearby workers. Daniel, working on the barn's far side, hadn't heard. Josephine was on her own. "Then you'll be looking for a while," she replied calmly. "I reorganized the tools by task and location an hour ago, but feel free to waste time searching if your pride requires it." Blackwood glared at her, but practical need won over prejudice. He stomped toward the north corner, grumbling. Martha Hendricks, who had witnessed the exchange, appeared at Josephine's side. "Well handled," she said quietly. "Chester's got opinions about everything and sense about nothing. Don't let him rattle you. I've dealt with worse." "I imagine you have." Martha surveyed the construction progress. "You've got this organization running smooth," Samuel noticed. "That matters more than Chester's grumbling." By midday, the barn's frame was taking shape, the skeleton of walls rising against the clear sky. The workers broke for a meal, gathering around the laden tables with the hearty appetite of hard physical labor. Josephine found herself answering questions from curious ranchers' wives, explaining her role at Daniel's ranch with matter-of-fact directness that seemed to satisfy most concerns. The afternoon brought unexpected drama when one of the younger workers, Jacob Summers, lost his footing on a high beam. He fell 15 feet, landing hard on his left arm. The sickening crack of breaking bone silenced the entire gathering. Jacob's wife screamed, and several men rushed to his side, but no one seemed certain what to do. "Don't move him," Josephine called out, pushing through the crowd. She knelt beside Jacob, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "I need someone to hold his shoulders steady. The bone needs to be set before it swells too much." "You know about doctoring?" someone asked skeptically. "My father was a physician. I assisted him for years." She glanced up at the circle of watching faces. "I can set this properly, but I need clean cloth for binding and 2 straight pieces of wood for a splint." Daniel appeared with the materials before anyone else could react, his expression one of absolute confidence in her capability. With his help steadying Jacob, Josephine set the broken bone with a smooth competence that came from years of watching and occasionally assisting her father. Jacob gritted his teeth through the pain but didn't cry out. When she finished binding the splint, he looked at her with something approaching awe. "That's as good as any doctor I've seen," he said hoarsely. "Thank you, Miss Campbell." The crowd's attitude shifted perceptibly after that. Josephine wasn't just the woman with the limp, the charity case Daniel Thorne had taken in. She was someone useful, someone with skills that could matter in a crisis. By the time the barn raising concluded at dusk, with the structure fully framed and roofed, she had been invited to 3 different ranches for future visits, had received grudging respect even from Chester Blackwood, and had Martha Hendricks declaring her decent folk despite the town nonsense. On the ride home, Sarah dozed in the wagon bed, while Josephine sat beside Daniel on the driver's bench. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the darkness, and the temperature dropping rapidly. "You did well today," Daniel said quietly. "I proved I'm not useless. You proved what I already knew, that you belong here." He glanced at her in the starlight. "Samuel Morrison mentioned he'd heard from his cousin Garrett. Words spread about you being at my ranch. Garrett's not pleased. Should I be worried? Not while you're here, but he's got reach, and winter's coming. We'll be isolated soon." Josephine pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "Good. Let him reach all he wants. I'm exactly where I choose to be." Daniel nodded, satisfied with that answer. Whatever challenges Winter and Garrett Morrison might bring, they would face them together. The lonely rancher had found something worth protecting, and the woman mocked for limping had discovered a place where her worth was measured by more than physical perfection. The wagon rolled on through the darkness, carrying them home. Winter arrived in earnest the first week of November, a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left snowdrifts as high as the porch railing. Daniel woke on the 4th morning to find both Campbells already awake, Sarah cooking breakfast while Josephine studied the account books by lamplight, her expression troubled. "We have a problem," she said without preamble when he entered the kitchen. "The feed calculations were off. With the snow this deep, the cattle will need supplemental hay earlier than expected. At current consumption rates, we'll run short by mid-February." Daniel poured coffee, reviewing her figures. She was right. He'd miscalculated, a mistake that could cost him animals and income. "Tom Hendricks might have surplus," he suggested. "I already factored in what we bought from him. We need more." Josephine tapped the ledger with her pencil. "Samuel Morrison mentioned at the barn raising that he overpurchased this year. If we can reach him before the next storm, we might negotiate a sale." The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. Seeking help from Morrison, even one unrelated to Garrett's machinations. But Samuel had proven himself different from his cousin, and pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Roads will be difficult," Daniel said. It's a full day's journey in good weather, maybe two in this snow. Then we should leave today while there's a break in the weather. Josephine closed the ledger. I'll go with you. Samuel knows me now, and I can negotiate better terms than you would alone. You're too honest for your own good. Sarah looked up from the stove, concern etched on her face. That's dangerous in these conditions. If another storm comes while you're out there. Mother, we don't have a choice. The cattle are our income. Without them we lose everything. Josephine's voice was gentle but firm. I'll be fine. Daniel knows this country better than anyone. They departed within the hour, bundled in layers of wool and fur, the wagon loaded with trade goods Daniel hoped might sweeten any deal. The landscape had transformed into an alien world of white, familiar landmarks obscured by snow. Daniel drove carefully, reading the terrain through subtle signs, the angle of drifts, the shadows of buried fence posts, the behavior of his horses, who knew instinctively where solid ground lay. Josephine sat beside him, her face partially hidden by a thick scarf, but her eyes alert to every detail of their surroundings. She was learning to read the land too, asking questions about how he navigated, why he chose certain routes over others. Her mind absorbed practical knowledge, the way it once absorbed literature and mathematics, filing information for future use. Tell me about your parents, she said after an hour of silent travel. You never speak of them. Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Not much to tell. Father built the ranch from nothing, worked himself into an early grave doing it. Mother followed 6 months later. Some people said it was her heart, but I think she just didn't want to live without him. Were they happy? Don't know. They were partners, I suppose, respected each other. But happy? He shrugged. Frontier life doesn't leave much room for happiness. It's mostly about surviving until tomorrow. That's bleak. That's realistic. Daniel glanced at her. What about your parents? They loved each other, Josephine said simply. Not in the passionate way novels describe, but in small daily choices. The way my father would save the best piece of meat for my mother. How she would wait up, no matter how late his calls ran. When he died, part of her died too. She's been just existing since then. Until now. Josephine considered this. Maybe. She seems more alive lately. Having a purpose again, a household to manage. She's been teaching me her recipes, things she learned from her mother. Said she wanted them written down before they were forgotten. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat the cold lunch Sarah had packed. Standing in the lee of a snow-covered outcrop, Daniel showed Josephine how to read cloud formations, predicting when the next storm might arrive. There, he pointed to a dark band on the northwestern horizon. That'll hit by nightfall. We need to reach Samuel's by then, or find shelter. They pushed on, the horses laboring through deepening drifts. Josephine's leg ached from the cold and immobility, but she made no complaint. She had learned that endurance was its own form of strength, that pushing through discomfort was simply part of life out here. Samuel Morrison's ranch appeared through the blowing snow like a mirage. They arrived as the first flakes of the new storm began to fall, and Samuel himself came out to meet them, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Thorne, Miss Campbell, you picked a hell of a time to visit." He helped them unhitch the horses. "Storm's going to be bad. You'll stay the night. No arguments." Over dinner with Samuel and his 2 teenage sons, Daniel and Josephine explained their situation. Samuel listened carefully, asking pointed questions about their calculations and winter planning. When they finished, he sat back, considering. "I can help," he said finally. "Got more hay than I need, but I'll be honest with you, there's complications. My cousin Garrett's been spreading poison about you both, Thorne. Says you're harboring his intended, that you've destroyed her reputation and his business relationship with you. His intended? Josephine's voice was sharp. I refused his proposal months ago. He's telling folks you accepted, then ran off with Thorne. Claims he's been publicly humiliated. Samuel's expression was apologetic. I don't believe it, for what that's worth. But there's ranchers who do business with Garrett who might think twice about dealing with you now. Daniel felt cold fury settle in his gut. Let them think about what they want. We need the hay, Samuel. Name your price. No price. I'll give it to you at cost, and we'll call it neighboring. But you need to know what you're up against. Samuel leaned forward. Garrett filed a complaint with the territorial marshal. Claims Josephine's being held against her will, that her mother's being coerced. It's nonsense, but it gives him legal cover to cause trouble. Josephine's face paled. He can't actually believe that would work. Doesn't matter what he believes, matters what he can make others believe. Samuel looked between them. The marshal's coming to investigate after the winter thaw. You'll need to be prepared for that. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them at Samuel's ranch. During that time, Josephine found an unexpected mentor in Samuel's oldest son, Marcus, a quiet, young man of 19 who had taken over much of the ranch's management after his mother died. He showed her his organizational systems, more sophisticated than anything she'd seen, tracking not just supplies but animal health, breeding schedules, market price fluctuations. You've got a good head for this, Marcus observed as they reviewed his ledgers. Better than most ranchers I know. You thinking of running your own place someday? It's Daniel's ranch, Josephine replied automatically. But you're the one managing it. There's a difference. Marcus studied her with the seriousness of someone wise beyond his years. Out here, ownership's just paper. What matters is who can make the land produce, who can keep everything running when things go wrong. That's real power, Miss Campbell. Don't forget that. The words stayed with Josephine during the long journey home, during the careful unloading of the hay Samuel had generously provided, during the quiet evenings that followed as winter deepened around them. She was no longer just surviving or even just helping. She was becoming integral to the ranch's operation, making decisions that affected their collective future. Christmas came quietly, marked by Sarah's special cooking and small handmade gifts exchanged by lamplight. Josephine had carved a new handle for Daniel's favorite knife, smoother and better balanced than the original. He gave her a pair of leather gloves he'd ordered from Cheyenne, lined with fur and designed to fit her hands perfectly for winter work. Sarah received a new rocking chair Daniel had built in secret, its arms smooth as silk, its joints perfectly fitted. "This is the best Christmas I've had in years," Sarah said softly, tears in her eyes. "Not because of the gifts, but because we're together, because we have purpose." As January deepened into February, the isolation Samuel had warned about became reality. Days passed where they saw nothing but each other and the endless white landscape. The freeze work continued, reduced but constant. Animals to feed, snow to clear, equipment to maintain and repair. The three of them developed routines, rhythms of coexistence that felt increasingly like family. Josephine's competence grew daily. She could now manage the horses independently, shoot accurately enough to bring down a rabbit for dinner, read weather signs almost as well as Daniel. Her leg still limited her, but she had learned to work within those limits so effectively that it rarely mattered. More importantly, she had stopped seeing it as a limitation and started seeing it simply as a characteristic, no more defining than the color of her hair. One evening in late February, Daniel found her in the barn, grooming her horse with the careful attention he'd taught her. The lamplight caught the copper in her hair, the concentration on her face, and something shifted in his chest, a realization that had been building for months. "You've changed," he said, not meaning to speak aloud. Josephine looked up, startled. "Changed how?" "When you first came here, you moved like you were apologizing for taking up space. Now you move like you belong." She considered this, her hand still on the horse's flank. "I suppose I have changed. This place changes people, doesn't it? Strips away everything that doesn't matter and shows you what's real." "And what's real?" Daniel asked quietly. "That strength isn't about perfection. That belonging is about what you contribute, not what you look like." "That," she paused, meeting his gaze directly, "that some places feel like home even when you never expected to find one." They stood there in the lamp-lit barn, years of loneliness and isolation falling away between them. Daniel took a step forward, then stopped himself, uncertain of welcome. "Josephine, I—" The barn door burst open. Sarah stood there, her face white, clutching a letter. "This just arrived. A rider from town made it through the pass." Daniel took the letter, recognizing the territorial marshal's seal. He read it quickly, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Josephine demanded. "Marshal's coming in 2 weeks. Garrett filed formal charges. Kidnapping, fraud, moral corruption." Daniel's voice was tight with controlled anger. "He's claiming we conspired to defraud him of his intended bride, that you're being held here through manipulation and your mother through threats." "That's insane," Josephine breathed. "Doesn't matter. It's official now. The marshal has to investigate." Daniel crumpled the letter. "And if Garrett's paid the right people, bought the right testimonies, he might make it stick." Sarah sank onto a hay bale, her face aged 10 years in seconds. "What happens if the marshal believes him? They'll take you both back to Millbrook. Garrett will have won, and I'll likely face charges myself." Daniel's jaw was set. "But that's not going to happen." "How can you stop it?" Josephine's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If the law is on his side, then we make sure the law hears the truth, the whole truth, from everyone who matters." Daniel was already planning, his mind working through possibilities. "The ranchers who've seen you work, who know you're here by choice, Samuel Morrison's testimony against his own cousin. Documentation of everything, your contributions, your decisions, proof. This is genuine employment, not coercion." "Will that be enough?" Sarah asked. "It has to be," Daniel looked at Josephine, "unless you want to run. I could get you to Denver, far enough that Garrett's reach doesn't extend. You'd be safe." "I'm not running," Josephine's voice was steel. "I've spent my whole life accommodating other people's prejudices, living small so I wouldn't offend anyone. I'm done with that. This is my home now, and I'll fight for it." The determination in her eyes matched his own, and Daniel felt something settle into place, a certainty that had been building since that first day in Millbrook, when he'd carried her through a hostile crowd. "Then we fight," he said simply, "together." Sarah looked between them, seeing something that perhaps they hadn't fully acknowledged themselves yet. "Together," she echoed quietly. "Yes, I suppose that's what we are now." Over the following days they prepared. Daniel rode to neighboring ranches despite the snow, securing written statements. Josephine organized every scrap of documentation, creating an irrefutable paper trail of legitimate employment and voluntary residence. Sarah added her own testimony, detailing the circumstances that brought them here and the life they'd built. But beneath the preparation ran an undercurrent of deeper feeling, an awareness that had been growing throughout the winter. In the long evenings by the fire, in the shared work of daily survival, in the moments when their hands would brush passing tools or their eyes would meet across the room, something profound was taking root. The night before the marshal was due to arrive, Josephine sat at the kitchen table, reviewing their documentation one final time. Daniel found her there past midnight, lamp burning low, shadows under her eyes from exhaustion. "It's as ready as it can be," he said gently. "What if it's not enough? What if—" "Then we deal with it. But worrying tonight won't change tomorrow." He sat across from her, his work-roughened hands flat on the table. "Josephine, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that bringing you here was the best decision I've made. This ranch was just a place I existed before. You and your mother made it a home." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes, the first he'd seen from her since that terrible day in Millbrook. "I was so lost when I came here, so convinced my life was over. But you saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. You gave me a chance to become someone I didn't know I could be. I didn't give you anything. You earned every bit of it." "No," she said softly, "you gave me something more valuable than work or wages. You gave me back my dignity, my sense of worth." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Whatever the marshal decides tomorrow, that can't be taken away." Daniel's fingers curled around hers, the gesture speaking volumes that words couldn't capture. They sat like that in the lamplit kitchen, the wind howling outside, preparing to face whatever judgment the morning would bring. Upstairs, Sarah Campbell lay awake in her own room, listening to the murmur of voices below. She thought of her late husband, of how he would have approved of Daniel Thorne, of this strange new life they'd built. Her daughter had found something here that Millbrook's rigid society could never have given her, not just acceptance but genuine respect, earned through capability and courage. As dawn approached, grey and cold, a rider appeared on the horizon. The territorial marshal had arrived early, and with him came the moment of reckoning that would determine all their futures. Marshal William Cortland was not what Daniel expected. Instead of the corrupt territorial official he'd braced for, a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose body had survived decades of hard service. His face was weathered but intelligent, his eyes sharp with the kind of perception that came from years of separating truth from lies. "Daniel Thorne?" he called out, surveying the ranch with professional thoroughness. "Marshal." Daniel stepped off the porch, positioning himself between Cortland and the house where Josephine and Sarah waited. "Wasn't expecting you until afternoon. I prefer catching people before they've had time to rehearse their stories." Cortland's gaze moved past Daniel to the house. "Where were the Campbell women?" "It is. They're here voluntarily, Marshal. I have documentation. I'll see that in due time. First, I'd like to speak with Miss Campbell." "Alone," Cortland's tone was. Firm, but not unkind. "Standard procedure in kidnapping investigations." "This isn't kidnapping." "Then you've got nothing to worry about." Cortland tied his horse to the rail. "But I need to hear that from her, without you standing over her shoulder." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. This was the moment they'd prepared for. Josephine would have to convince the marshal herself, and he'd have to trust that she could. Josephine appeared in the doorway, her posture straight, her expression composed, despite the tension Daniel could read in her eyes. She wore one of her better dresses, her hair neatly arranged, every inch the educated woman she'd been in Millbrook. But there was something different now, a confidence that went deeper than appearance. "Marshal Cortland," she greeted him calmly. "I've been expecting you. Would you like to come inside? My mother has coffee ready." For the next hour, Daniel paced the porch while Josephine spoke privately with the marshal. Sarah joined him, her hands twisting in her apron, both of them straining to hear the murmur of conversation through the windows. Finally, the door opened, and Cortland emerged, his expression unreadable. "Miss Campbell has answered my initial questions," he said. "Now I'd like to inspect the premises, speak with both of you together, and review any documentation you've prepared." They spent the remainder of the morning showing Cortland everything. The separate bedrooms, establishing propriety, the account books showing legitimate employment and wages paid, the correspondence proving Josephine's central role in ranch management. Cortland examined it all with meticulous attention, asking pointed questions, making notes in a small leather journal. "Impressive record-keeping," he observed, flipping through Josephine's ledgers. "Better than most ranch operations I've seen. You learned this from your father?" "And from necessity," Josephine replied. "Good records are the difference between profit and failure out here." "And you chose to come here? No coercion, no promises beyond employment?" "I chose to come here because Mr. Thorne offered me something Millbrook never did, the opportunity to prove my worth through my work rather than be judged solely by my physical limitation." Josephine's voice was steady, but Daniel heard the emotion beneath it. "I've found respect here, Marshal, and purpose. Those aren't things anyone can force on another person." Cortland nodded slowly, making another note. "Mr. Morrison claims you were engaged to him, that you fled to avoid that obligation." "Garrett Morrison proposed marriage. I declined. There was never an engagement." Josephine's eyes flashed. "If he's claiming otherwise, he's lying to salvage his pride. Why would a man of his standing lie about something so easily disproven? Because he's a man who believes everything and everyone has a price, who can't comprehend that someone might refuse what he's offering." Josephine's hands clenched. "He destroyed my career, my reputation, turned an entire town against me when I wouldn't submit to his will. This investigation is just another attempt to control me." Before Cortland could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. A group of riders appeared on the southern trail, 8 men led by someone Daniel recognized immediately, even at a distance. Garrett Morrison had come himself, accompanied by several Millbrook businessmen, and Daniel noted with cold anger Chester Blackwood from the neighboring ranches. "Marshal Cortland," Morrison called out as they approached, his voice carrying false warmth. "Good to see you made it through. These winter trails can be treacherous." Cortland's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Morrison, I thought we'd agreed you'd remain in Millbrook during my investigation." "Couldn't leave this entirely in your hands, Marshal. Too much at stake." Morrison dismounted with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. His gaze swept past Cortland to fix on Josephine with an intensity that made Daniel's fists clench. "Josephine, my dear, you look well despite everything." "Don't call me that," Josephine said coldly. "We have no relationship that permits such familiarity." Morrison's smile didn't waver, but something cruel flickered in his eyes. "Still stubborn, I see. That's what comes from spending too much time out here, away from civilizing influences." He turned to the marshal. "I trust you've discovered the truth, that this woman was lured away from her proper place through false promises." "What I've discovered," Cortland said carefully, "is a legitimate employment arrangement between consenting adults. Miss Campbell has been quite clear about her reasons for being here." "Of course she has. She's been coached, threatened. Look at her, Marshal." Morrison gestured dismissively. "A crippled woman doing ranch work? It's absurd on its face. Thorne's obviously using her for something else. And her poor mother is trapped as well. I'll thank you not to speculate about my character." Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And to watch your tongue regarding Miss Campbell? Or what? You'll add assault to kidnapping." Morrison's false pleasantness was cracking. "You've made a fool's mistake, Thorne. Did you really think you could steal my intended bride and face no consequences? I never agreed to marry you." Josephine's composure finally broke, her voice rising. "I refused you clearly and repeatedly. You're the one who couldn't accept that rejection, who destroyed my livelihood out of spite. I did nothing but tell the truth, that you were unsuitable for teaching impressionable young women." Morrison took a step toward her, his expression hardening. "And I'm offering you redemption now. Come back to Millbrook, accept my proposal, and I'll forget this entire unfortunate episode. You'll have security, comfort, and a proper place in society. I'd rather die than belong to you." The words hung in the cold air, absolute and final. Morrison's face flushed red, the mask of civility finally dropping completely. "Then you'll have nothing," he snarled. "I've bought half the territory officials between here and Cheyenne. When I'm done, Thorne will be charged as a kidnapper. You'll be returned to Millbrook as an incompetent ward, and your mother will spend her final years in a charity home. All because you were too proud to accept the generous offer of a man far above your station." "That sounds like a threat, Morrison," Marshal Cortland interjected, his voice cutting through the tension. "And threatening witnesses during an official investigation is a serious offense. It's reality, Marshal. I'm simply explaining the consequences." Morrison's eyes never left Josephine's face. "Last chance, my dear. Come with me now, voluntarily, and everyone benefits. Refuse, and I'll make sure you regret it for whatever miserable years remain to you." Josephine looked at Morrison, at the casual cruelty in his expression, at the absolute certainty that his money and influence would prevail. 6 months ago, she might have capitulated, might have accepted defeat to spare her mother further suffering. But 6 months ago, she had been a different person. "No," she said clearly. "I'm staying exactly where I am." Morrison's control snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Josephine's arm with brutal force. "You'll do as you're told." He never finished the sentence. Daniel moved like lightning, his fist connecting with Morrison's jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. Morrison staggered backward, releasing Josephine, blood trickling from his split lip. His companions moved to intervene, but Cortland's drawn pistol froze them in place. "That's enough," the marshal barked. "Everyone stays where they are." Morrison dabbed at his bleeding mouth, rage contorting his features. "You saw that, Marshal. Assault. Added to the charges. What I saw was a man defending a woman from physical assault." Cortland's voice was ice. "You grabbed Miss Campbell against her will, Morrison. That makes you the aggressor. She's mine. I have rights." "You have no rights over her whatsoever," Cortland interrupted. "And this investigation is concluded. Miss Campbell is here voluntarily, gainfully employed, and under no duress. Your charges are dismissed." "You can't, I've paid." Morrison caught himself, but the damage was done. "Paid?" Cortland's expression darkened. "You just confessed to attempting to bribe territorial officials." "That's a crime, Mr. Morrison." The color drained from Morrison's face as he realized his mistake. "I misspoke. What I meant, I know exactly what you meant." Cortland turned to his horse, extracting official papers from his saddlebag. "I'm filing a report recommending investigation into your business practices and your attempts to corrupt this investigation. Meanwhile, you'll leave this property immediately and have no further contact with Miss Campbell or the Thorne Ranch." "This isn't over," Morrison hissed, his gaze sweeping across them all. I have influence, connections. You'll all regret this. Get off my land, Daniel said quietly, before I give you something more substantial to regret. For a moment, Morrison looked ready to escalate further, but Cortland's hand rested meaningfully on his pistol. With a final venomous glare, Morrison mounted his horse and spurred it viciously. His companions followed, Chester Blackwood casting an apologetic glance back before riding away. The silence that followed their departure was profound. Sarah emerged from the house where she'd been watching, her face pale but relieved. Josephine stood very still, rubbing her arm where Morrison had grabbed her, her expression distant. "Miss Campbell," Cortland said gently, "you should have that arm looked at. He grabbed you hard." "I'm fine." Josephine's voice was mechanical. "Thank you, Marshal, for believing in me." "I believe the evidence, Miss Campbell." And the evidence was clear. He tucked his papers away. "I'll file my report, but I should warn you Morrison wasn't bluffing about having influence. This may not be entirely finished." "Let him try," Daniel said. "We'll be ready." After Cortland departed, promising to return if needed for further proceedings, the three of them stood on the porch in the late afternoon sun. The confrontation had drained them all, leaving behind a strange mixture of victory and exhaustion. "Is it really over?" Sarah asked quietly. "The immediate threat is," Daniel replied. "But Cortland's right. Morrison won't give up easily. Then we'll face whatever comes next." Josephine turned to Daniel, and for the first time since Morrison's arrival, her composure cracked. "You hit him. You actually hit Garrett Morrison. He touched you." Daniel's voice was flat. "Nobody touches you like that while I'm breathing." The simple declaration, delivered without drama or expectation of praise, somehow broke through Josephine's shock. She started to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that shifted into tears, months of fear and tension finally releasing. Sarah moved to comfort her daughter, but Daniel was already there, his arms around Josephine in a gesture that was both protective and desperately tender. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe. You're home." "Home," Josephine whispered against his chest. "Yes, this is home." They stood like that as the sun descended toward the western horizon, three people who had found each other through crisis and built something worth fighting for. The battle with Morrison wasn't truly over. Men like him never surrendered easily. But they had won this round, had proven that truth and determination could stand against money and influence. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Sarah cleared her throat meaningfully. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should discuss what happens next." "What do you mean?" Josephine asked. "I mean that I'm not blind, daughter. I've watched you and Daniel these past months. The way you work together, the way you've built something here." Sarah's gaze was knowing. "Morrison called you his intended bride. But it seems to me that particular title might belong to someone else, if the two of you would stop being so stubborn about admitting what's obvious to everyone else." Josephine's face flushed crimson. Daniel suddenly found his plate fascinating. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Sarah laughed. "Oh, for heaven's sake, you're both adults. Daniel, you love my daughter. Josephine, you love this man. Are we really going to pretend otherwise?" "Mother," Josephine gasped. "Sarah," Daniel started, but she cut him off. "Don't Sarah me. I've lost one family to death and nearly lost another to Morrison's machinations. Life's too short and too uncertain for dancing around what matters." She stood, gathering dishes with pointed efficiency. "I'll be in the kitchen. You two figure out what you want, and when you're ready to stop being foolish, let me know." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Daniel and Josephine alone at the table. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel found his voice. "Is she right?" he asked quietly. "About how you feel?" Josephine's hands twisted in her lap. "I never expected to feel this way about anyone. I thought my life would be teaching, books, taking care of my mother. Marriage seemed like something that happened to other people." She finally met his eyes. "But yes, she's right. Though I didn't realize it myself until Morrison grabbed me today, and all I could think was that I'd fight him to my last breath rather than leave here, rather than leave you." Daniel reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I've been alone so long, I forgot what it felt like to need someone, to want to share everything with them, not just work but thoughts, hopes, the small moments that don't mean anything except to two people who care." His thumb traced patterns on her palm. "You changed that. Changed me. Made me remember what living feels like instead of just existing." "So what do we do about it?" Josephine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose," Daniel said slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. "We could start by admitting that your mother's right, that this ranch isn't just yours or mine, but ours. That we're building something together that matters more than employment arrangements or property ownership. And then, when you're ready, if you're willing, maybe we will make it official. Not because society demands it or because Morrison's forcing our hand, but because it's what we both want." He paused, suddenly uncertain. "Unless I'm presuming too much." Josephine's laugh was genuine this time, bright and unguarded. "Daniel Thorne, are you asking me to marry you?" "Badly, apparently. I'm out of practice with this sort of thing." "Then let me make it easier." Josephine squeezed his hand. "Yes. Whenever you get around to asking properly, yes." From the kitchen came the distinct sound of Sarah's pleased humming, and they both realized she'd been listening to everything, but neither of them minded. After months of struggle and uncertainty, of facing down prejudice and threats, they had found something rare and precious, a partnership built on respect, trust, and love that had grown from the most unlikely of circumstances. Outside, the winter stars were beginning to appear, cold and brilliant in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Morrison would lick his wounds and plot revenge. Winter still had months to run. But tonight, in the warmth of the ranch house that had become home, three people who had been broken by loss and cruelty had found wholeness together. The lonely rancher was lonely no more. The woman mocked for limping had learned to run in her own way. And together, they had discovered that sometimes the most important journeys don't take you where you expected, but exactly where you needed to be. Spring arrived with the sudden violence characteristic of Wyoming weather. 3 days of warm Chinook winds that melted snow faster than the ground could absorb it. The creek swelled to a roaring torrent, and the ranch transformed from white desolation to muddy promise, seemingly overnight. Daniel spent long days checking fences damaged by winter ice and preparing fields for planting, while Josephine and Sarah threw open every window, airing out months of closed-up living. It was mid-April when the letter arrived, delivered by a postal rider making his first run since the pass cleared. Josephine was working in the garden plot, marking out rows for Sarah's ambitious vegetable plans, when Daniel brought it to her. The envelope was expensive, cream-colored paper with an ornate return address from Boston. "Whitmore Academy," Josephine read aloud, confused. "I don't know anyone." "There." She opened it carefully, scanning the elegant script. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock as she read. "What is it?" Daniel asked, concern in his voice. "It's a job offer." Josephine reread the letter as if not trusting her first interpretation. Whitmore Academy for Young Ladies in Boston, one of the most prestigious schools in the country. They're offering me a position as head mathematics instructor with a salary triple what I earned in Millbrook. How did they even hear about you? Josephine turned the letter over, finding a postscript. Marshall Cortland. He wrote to them after his investigation, mentioned my qualifications and circumstances. Apparently the headmistress is his sister. She looked up at Daniel, bewilderment in her eyes. They want me to start in September. They're even offering to pay relocation expenses. Sarah emerged from the house, drawn by their voices. What's happened? Josephine handed her the letter, watching her mother's face as she read. Sarah's expression was complicated, pride warring with something else. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully. This is quite an opportunity, she said quietly. Everything you lost in Millbrook and more. Respectability, financial security, a chance to teach at the highest level. Yes, Josephine agreed, but her voice was flat. You should consider it seriously, Sarah continued, though each word seemed to pain her. This is the kind of position that could establish you for life. No more depending on... She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air. No more depending on Daniel's charity, on ranch work that exceeded her physical capabilities, on a fragile arrangement that Morrison's influence could still potentially destroy. Daniel had gone very still, his face carefully neutral. Your mother's right. It's an exceptional offer. Stop, Josephine said sharply. Both of you, stop. She took the letter from Sarah's hands, staring at it as if it were a test she hadn't studied for. You're both so eager to send me away. That's not what I meant, Sarah protested. Isn't it? You're listing all the practical reasons why I should go, all the ways this life is difficult or uncertain, as if security and respectability are the only things that matter. They're not nothing, Sarah replied. I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion this winter, watched you push through pain every day because you won't admit when something's too much. In Boston, you wouldn't have to do that. In Boston, I'd be Miss Campbell, the accomplished cripple who overcame her limitations through charitable intervention. Josephine's voice was tight. I'd teach girls who would pity me while pretending respect. I'd live in a comfortable room at a prestigious school and be grateful for my place, while everyone quietly celebrated how far I'd come despite my deficiency. That's not fair, Sarah began, but Josephine cut her off. It's completely fair. I lived that life. Mother, I know exactly what it would be. And yes, it would be easier in many ways. Easier than hauling water, than fighting snowdrifts, than proving myself every single day. She turned to Daniel, something fierce in her eyes. But easy isn't the same as right, and comfortable isn't the same as home. Daniel's carefully maintained neutrality cracked. Josephine, I won't hold you here out of obligation or misplaced loyalty. If this is what you want, it's not. The certainty in her voice stopped him mid-sentence. What I want is this ranch, this life, this partnership we've built. What I want is the respect I've earned through capability, not the pity I'd receive through limitation. What I want is to stay exactly where I am. She walked to the garden's edge, staring out at the thawing land, at the mountains still capped with snow in the distance. When she spoke again, her voice was calmer but no less determined. 6 months ago, I would have taken this offer without hesitation, would have seen it as rescue from disaster, a return to the life I thought I wanted. But that woman doesn't exist anymore. She died in that street in Millbrook, when everyone she thought she knew proved they never really saw her at all. Josephine turned back to face them. Out here, I'm not the teacher with the unfortunate leg who's doing remarkably well considering. I'm just Josephine, who can ride, shoot, manage accounts, negotiate with ranchers, and keep this operation running efficiently. My worth isn't qualified or excused. It's simply acknowledged. But the hardship, Sarah started, isn't hardship when you choose it, Josephine finished. It's just life. And I choose this life, this place, this. She looked directly at Daniel. This future. Daniel crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made Sarah's eyes mist. You're certain? Because once you refuse this, once we... He paused, choosing his words carefully. There's no going back to what you were before. I don't want to go back. Josephine's hands covered his. I only want to move forward, with you. Here, then marry me, Daniel said, the words finally spoken aloud without hesitation or condition, not because it's practical or proper, but because I love you, because you've made me believe in futures I'd stopped imagining, because I want to spend every day of whatever time we have watching you conquer whatever challenges come next. Yes, Josephine said simply. I thought I answered this already. You answered a hypothetical. I needed to ask for real. Daniel smiled, that rare expression that transformed his weathered face. We should probably make it official before Sarah starts planning without our input. Too late, Sarah called from the porch, not even pretending she hadn't been listening. I've been planning for weeks. Someone had to. You two were being so stubborn about admitting the obvious. The wedding took place 6 weeks. Later, on a brilliant May morning with the entire ranching community in attendance, Samuel Morrison stood as Daniel's witness, his presence a deliberate rebuke to his cousin who had not been invited and, according to reports from Millbrook, had left Wyoming entirely after Marshal Cortland's investigation uncovered systematic fraud in his business dealings. The ceremony was held in the ranch's front meadow, where wildflowers had burst into riotous bloom. Martha Hendricks had insisted on organizing everything with Sarah, the 2 women bonding over their shared determination to see things done properly. The result was an event that balanced frontier practicality with genuine elegance. Josephine wore a dress Sarah had made, simple ivory linen that moved beautifully when she walked. No elaborate train to trip over, no restricting corset to limit breathing. Her hair hung loose with wildflowers woven through it, and she carried no bouquet, needing her walking stick to navigate the uneven ground. But she moved with such confidence, such obvious joy, that the stick became simply part of who she was, rather than a limitation to overlook. The minister was a circuit preacher who served the scattered ranching community, a practical man who kept the service brief and focused on partnership rather than female submission. When he asked if anyone objected, the silence was absolute except for the wind through the grass and the distant call of a hawk. "I do," said a voice from the back of the gathered crowd. Every head turned. Chester Blackwood stood there, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I object to my own past behavior, Miss Campbell, Mrs. Thorne. Now, I suppose I was cruel when we first met, said things no man should say to anyone. I'm standing here to apologize publicly and say you've earned every bit of respect you've received. More than earned it." The unexpected apology brought tears to more than one eye. Josephine nodded her acceptance, and the ceremony continued, without further interruption. When Daniel kissed his new wife, the assembled ranchers cheered with genuine happiness, celebrating not just a wedding, but the triumph of 2 people who had fought for the right to choose their own path. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under the emerging stars. Josephine danced with Daniel despite her leg, the two of them moving in a close embrace that accommodated her limitations while celebrating what they'd built together. She danced with Tom Hendricks, with Samuel Morrison, even with old Chester Blackwood, who apologized again and promised to spread word that any rancher who treated her poorly would answer to him. As the party wound down and guests began the journey back to their own properties, Martha Hendricks pulled Josephine aside. "You did good," she said simply. "Took what could have destroyed you and built something stronger. That's rare. Don't forget it when times get hard again, because they will. They always do." "I won't forget," Josephine promised. "Any of it. The bad parts made the good parts possible." After the last guest departed, Daniel, Josephine, and Sarah sat on the porch in comfortable silence. The spring night was cool but not cold, full of the sounds of waking life, frogs in the creek, night birds calling, the soft movement of horses in the nearby pasture. "I received my own letter this week," Sarah said quietly. "Didn't mention it with all the wedding preparations." Both Daniel and Josephine turned to her, alert to something in her tone. "From my sister in Denver," Sarah continued. "She's widowed now, living alone in a house too big for one person. She's asked me to come stay with her. Permanently." Josephine's face fell. "Mother, no, you can't leave." "Can't I?" Sarah smiled gently. "Sweetheart, I love you, and I'm proud of what you've built here. But you're starting a marriage. You don't need your mother hovering around like a third wheel. You're not," Josephine began, but Sarah raised a hand. "I'm not leaving tomorrow or even next month, but eventually, yes, you two need space to build your life together. And truthfully, I miss city conveniences more than I care to admit. Your father loved the frontier, but I never quite took to it the way you have." Daniel, who had been silent, finally spoke. "You'll always have a home here, Sarah, for as long as you want it. I know that, and I'll visit, especially once there are grandchildren to spoil." Sarah's eyes twinkled. "But this is Josephine's life now, not mine. I'm ready to start my own next chapter." The conversation drifted to other topics, but later that night, after Sarah had retired and Daniel and Josephine stood alone under the stars, Josephine leaned into her husband's embrace. "Everything's changing," she said softly. "Everything's already changed," Daniel corrected. "We're just living the results now. Are you happy? How did things turn out?" Daniel considered the question seriously, as he considered everything. 6 months ago, I was alone in this house, going through motions, waiting for nothing in particular. Now I have a wife who challenges me daily, makes me think harder and work smarter, who looks at problems and sees solutions I'd never have considered. He pulled her closer. "So yes, I'm happy, more than I thought possible. Even with all the complications I brought, Morrison's vendetta, the investigation, the gossip, especially with those, they proved what we are together, that we can face trouble and come through stronger." He kissed her forehead. "Besides, life without complications is just existing. I did that for years. I prefer living." The weeks that followed settled into new rhythms. Josephine's official role shifted from employee to partner, her name added to the ranch's title alongside Daniel's. She continued managing the business side while expanding into livestock breeding decisions and land use planning. Her correspondence with other ranchers increased, her organizational skills and analytical mind earning respect that extended beyond their immediate community. In June, a letter arrived from Whitmore Academy, acknowledging her refusal of their position, but asking if she would consider occasional consultation on mathematics curriculum development. The proposal intrigued her, offering a way to maintain connection to education without sacrificing the life she'd chosen. She accepted, establishing a pattern of sending detailed recommendations several times a year, work that engaged her intellect while remaining compatible with ranch responsibilities. Samuel Morrison visited one afternoon with unexpected news. "Thought you should know, Garrett's filed for bankruptcy. The marshal's investigation exposed enough fraud that his creditors descended like vultures. Last I heard, he was headed east, tail between his legs." "Good," Josephine said simply, surprising herself with how little satisfaction the news brought. Garrett Morrison had become irrelevant, his power to hurt her dissolved by the life she'd built beyond his reach. By late summer, Sarah had made her decision final, planning to move to Denver in early autumn. The parting was bittersweet but right, mother and daughter both recognizing it as necessary evolution rather than abandonment. On Sarah's last morning at the ranch, she embraced Josephine on the same porch where they'd arrived months earlier, two frightened refugees from their old life. "You've become who you were meant to be," Sarah whispered. "Your father would be so proud." "I wish he could have known Daniel," Josephine replied, tears streaming freely. "He does know. Wherever he is, he knows his daughter found someone who sees her as he did, completely and without reservation." Sarah pulled back, smiling through her own tears. "Now stop crying and kiss your husband goodbye. He's hovering like he wants to say something." Daniel approached as Sarah climbed into the wagon for her. Journey to town, and the stage that would take her to Denver. "Take care of yourself, Sarah. And come back whenever you want. The door's always open. I know. That's what makes leaving possible." She touched his arm. "Thank you for giving my daughter back to herself, and for loving her exactly as she is." They stood together, watching the wagon disappear down the trail, Josephine leaning into Daniel's solid presence. When the dust settled and they were truly alone, she turned to him. "Nervous?" he asked. "No, excited." Josephine looked at the ranch spread out before them, the house, the barn, the corrals and pastures, all of it theirs, built through partnership and determination. "This is ours now, completely. What should we do first?" "I have some ideas," Daniel said, a rare teasing note in his voice, "but they can wait. First, I want to show you something." He led her to the barn's back section, to a door that had been locked all summer. Inside, he'd been working on a surprise, a small office space with a desk, positioned beneath a window that overlooked the eastern hills. Shelves lined the walls, ready for ledgers and correspondence. The desk held new accounting books, quality pens, and a lamp for evening work. "I thought you needed a proper space," Daniel explained. "Somewhere the business end of the ranch had its own place, where you could work without being interrupted by my muddy boots tracking through the kitchen." Josephine ran her hand over the smooth desk surface, emotion tightening her throat. "It's perfect. There's more." He pulled out the desk's center drawer, revealing a small wooden plaque. She lifted it carefully, reading the engraved words. "Thorne Ranch. Daniel and Josephine Thorne, proprietors. We're in this together," Daniel said. "Equal partners in everything." "I wanted that official." Josephine set down the plaque and kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the gratitude and love and fierce joy she felt at having found this unexpected life. When they finally broke apart, she was laughing. "What?" Daniel asked, smiling at her happiness. "I was just thinking about that day in Millbrook. When you carried me through town and I was so angry, so humiliated, so certain my life was over. And now I realize it was just the beginning." She took his hand, interlacing their fingers. "Everything I thought I wanted, respectability, acceptance, a conventional life, it would have been a cage. Beautiful maybe, but still confining. Out here, with you, I'm free in ways I never imagined possible." They walked back to the house together as the sun descended, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and gold. The evening chores awaited, animals to feed, equipment to check, the endless cycle of ranch work that would fill their days and years ahead. There would be difficulties, seasons of hardship, moments of doubt, but there would also be triumph, partnership, and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. Josephine Campbell Thorne, who had once been mocked for limping through town, now walked beside her husband with pride and purpose. Her gait remained uneven, her legs still weak, but those facts had become simply characteristics rather than limitations. She had learned that strength came in many forms, that home was something you built rather than something given, and that the most important journeys often took you far from where you started, but exactly where you needed to be. That night, standing on their porch under a blanket of stars, Daniel wrapped his arms around his wife and spoke the words that had become their truth. "From now on, I'm your legs when you need them, and you're my direction when I lose my way. Partners," Josephine agreed, leaning back against his chest. "Partners," he confirmed, "in everything." The future stretched before them, unknown and full of possibility, but whatever it held, they would face it together, two people who had found in each other the strength to become more than they could have been alone. The lonely rancher and the woman who limped had discovered that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not through changing who you are, but through finding someone who helps you become who you were always meant to be. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.